Hi guys, hopefully everyone can hear me. Thanks for attending today. We're at the Veg Hotline here in Charleville. At the Veg Hotline, I think we've received close to 4,000 phone calls over the last few months about vegetation management. As we're going through today, if you ask questions, some of those will go through to the hotline staff, so feel free to ask whatever you want, and the hotline staff will get back to you with an answer. So today we're just going to give an overview of the vegetation management laws in Queensland, how they've changed, and what might affect you, particularly with fodder harvesting. And we've also got some tools and tricks for people who are doing work under the Accepted Development Clearing Code, so the free self-assessable code for fodder harvesting. So if everyone's right, I'm just going to go straight into it. So key points for today, changes, particularly the ones that affect us out here in the southwest. Fodder harvesting, managing thickened vegetation, which is also a bit of a hot topic, mapping and PMABs, monitoring and compliance, where to go for more information, and tools to help. So there's a couple of handouts from today. One will be a list of links to useful websites, things that you'll see mentioned in today's presentation. So what are we talking about with the vegetation management laws? The Vegetation Management Act 1999 and the Planning Act 2016. So those are the two acts that we're operating. All of this stuff that we're going to talk today is under. So what are the big changes for out here? So probably the big one is that the self-assessable code for managing thickened vegetation is gone. So if you want to do managing thickened vegetation, you'll have to get a permit. We've got a link a bit later on to look at those permits. There have been some changes to the fodder self-assessable code or Accepted Development Clearing Code. There's high value regrowth on Cat C. So high value regrowth Cat C on freehold if you didn't have a PMAV. So we have got a handful of those people who didn't get PMAVs and now have a bit of Cat C on their freehold land. They're one of the priorities for the Charleville and Roma teams is looking at how we help those people. There's also been a redefinition of high value regrowth. So now it's defined as vegetation that hasn't been cleared for the last 15 years, and it's a regional ecosystem. It applies to leasehold, freehold land, Indigenous land, and occupational licenses. So that's obviously if you haven't got a PMAV. So if you've got it locked in as Category X previously, that's not going to worry you. Some of the other changes that affect us out here, there's increased habitat and environmental protection. So you'll see that there's more essential habitat mapping than there used to be, and that does affect you if you're harvesting mulga. How we get around that is that how we find out about that is we download one of the property reports, and you'll find your essential habitat mapped in there. There's been a removal of provisions permitting clearing for high value agriculture and irrigated high value agriculture. So there used to be a code assessment to deal with that. That's gone as part of these changes. Obviously, it doesn't affect people so much out here as people more coastal. Having said that, I have talked to the policy guys, and there's some scope for coordinated projects. So when you're looking at agricultural projects of state significance, there's still some room to move there with big agricultural projects. Monitoring and compliance changes. So penalty units increase for offences. The size of area changed for PINs, and expanding power of entry. The middle one is the important one for out here, because once upon a time, so a penalty infringement notice could be issued for a maximum area of, I think it was about 10 hectares of least concern. So what that meant for people out here was, if you did over that area, there's really only a couple of options. One is to go to court, and one is restoration notice and things like that. You couldn't issue a smaller sort of fine, whereas now that's possible. You know, when we see some fodder harvesting that probably doesn't leave anything behind, you know, there can be issued a penalty infringement notice rather than having to take it to court. So one of the big changes that doesn't really affect us out here, unless you're calling in from Roma and you're a bit north of Roma, is the Category R mapping. So the Category R mapping, which is the reef catchments mapping, that now affects a bunch of new catchments further south in the state. So as you can see from the slide there, Burnett Mary is affected, Eastern Cape York, Fitzroy, Burdekin, McKay Whitsundays and Wet Tropics. So just once again, if you're north of Roma, just have a look at that. If you're calling in from somewhere else in the state, obviously, you know, that could affect you too. But for our southwestern guys, you'll find some stuff where it flows into the Dawson catchment and then into the Fitzroy. That stuff's affected now. So PMABs and mapping, you know, we've had a lot of questions about this. PMABs are fine. Your PMABs are fine. It's the main layer of mapping in the veg laws, so we always go to the PMAB first. If you had one locked in, you know, last year or early this year, before the 8th of March, you know, you're pretty well unaffected by the mapping changes. PMABs applied for after the 8th of March. You could have new Cat C or Cat R on freehold land. So landholders who are contesting the Cat C, so as I said, we had a handful of landholders that didn't get PMABs, and they're on freehold land. They now have Cat C, and they're looking at contesting that. They're one of the priorities of the Charleville office and the Roma office. So our priorities really are fodder harvesters, people who want to harvest fodder, making sure that the transition's easy for them, and also people that didn't get PMABs, we're sort of working on helping them as much as possible. The other change that affects us with mapping is that some of the REs have been reclassified, and a good example of that is Regional Ecosystem 652, which was reclassified as of concern. And that affects how much fodder you can actually take out of that regional ecosystem under the accepted development code for fodder harvesting. So fodder and thinning, in particular, fodder harvesting, what's changed? You can only notify for 500 hectares per notification. So once upon a time, or you know, last year, you could notify over the whole property. That's been reduced to a 500 hectare area. You can notify multiple times, but each time you'll need to complete a self-audit, and we'll have a bit of a look at that later on. The strip widths have been reduced. So as you probably know, the maximum strip width used to be 135 metres from memory. It's now down to 50 metres. You have to retain 75 metres, which is similar to the 135 metre wide strip where you had to retain 165 metre wide strips. So that's narrowed down. You need to check your supporting map for your regional ecosystems, just because of those changes where a couple of them have gone to of concern. Now, one thing that I found out was that you can still self-assess the RE type when you're fodder harvesting, but I will say, you know, use caution with that. So you'll find in that accepted development clearing code that you can actually self-assess your RE, and we'll have a little bit of a look at that later. Thinning, as previously mentioned, there's no self-assessable code for thinning anymore. Take a look at SDAP, apply through SARA. You know, we're suggesting people hold off for a little while, just because there is some developments in permit fees and the ease of getting a managing thickened vegetation permit. So maybe just give it a couple of months and take a look at it then. So this is what the SARA website looks like, the SDAP. So the SDAP is basically the code. I don't know if a lot of you applied for fodder permits in the old days, before any of this self-assessment came out. You'll remember you had to apply for a permit. So for thinning, that's fairly similar now. If you go into that SDAP, we'll provide a link for that. You can look at the code for applying for a permit, and it's the same sort of deal where you have a performance outcome and an accepted outcome. You can meet all the accepted outcomes and get your permit, sort of thing. So that's State Code 16, SDAT version 2.3, and we'll provide a link to that if anyone's interested in having a look at that. But basically, it's like the old days of applying for a permit. So that's just for thinning. Obviously, fodder's still free. So how do you start? A lot of you will have already done this. So you request a personalised property report. We'll provide a link to that. You put your lot on plan number in, and it'll send you an email, a PDF version of a bunch of maps and some other information. So you get your regulated vegetation map, your vegetation management supporting map, so your regional ecosystem map. There'll be a protected plants flora survey trigger map. So that's the Department of Environment and Science side of things. And you'll find out whether you've got a property map of accessible vegetation, and that'll be attached if you do have one. So what does the regulated vegetation management map look like? Dark blue, light blue, yellow generally. So the yellow there, you can see that's that category R, that watercourse mapping. The light blue's category C, high value regrowth, and the dark blue's the normal old category B, regulated vegetation. That one doesn't actually show any areas of category A, but they could be where someone's done a vegetation offset for a development, or there's a compliance notice or a voluntary declaration. What the supporting map looks like the old regional ecosystem map. You've got your endangered, of concern, of least concern vegetation, and you'll have the regional ecosystems listed on there, and the breakdown of those regional ecosystems might be 70-30 in an area. It'll have your essential habitat mapping and your watercourses and wetlands. So that's the one you look at for your working at your regional ecosystems and your essential habitat, if that's going to affect you with your fodder harvesting. The protected plants flora survey trigger map. Now I've put a number on there to call. So this is where there's some sort of protected plant in that area, and it may affect your development. It's actually not our department. And so with that one, we suggest if you've got that, which is going to be pretty rare, it'll be very rare to find that out here. But if you do have a spot like that on your map, on the protected plants flora survey trigger map, there's a number there to call. And you can have a chat to them about what that means. And it affects it affects different types of development in different ways. So what does the PMAV look like? That's one where they've got the category C, category B, and category X. It's the first point of truth, the PMAV, as far as legislation goes. So that's what we look at first off. When somebody rings up, we open up their PMAV, we say, yes, that's category X, you're fine to go. It doesn't matter what's happening underneath it, really. Obviously, the protected plants trigger map's a bit of an issue, as I said, but that's a different department. What do you do once you've got your property report? So you've downloaded your property report, it's been sent to your email. Check what clearing options apply to your property. So, you know, are you putting a fence line or a track through of least concern vegetation? Probably going to be exempt clearing. You probably don't need to talk, you know, you can ring the hotline just to check, but you're not going to probably need anything from us. Other types of property infrastructure are often covered by the Accepted Development Vegetation Clearing Code for property infrastructure. So a lot of things are permissible under that. You know, if you're in of concern and doing things like that, you may need to notify. You may be covered by an area management plan. There's a few of those still active around the place. The only one that really got canned was the big one that covered the whole Mulga lands. So there was a big one that covered the whole Mulga lands that was a precursor to the self-assessable codes. It came out as a stopgap between the old permitting system and the self-assessable codes. That one's gone, but a lot of the other ones remain active. A lot of you who are operating under those know about it already, and you're just continuing to do that work. they'll be phased out over the next couple of years. Many of them have reached their 10-year time frame anyway. And obviously, you've always been able to get development permits for different things. You can still get one for fodder harvesting if you so desire. And managing thickened vegetation's available under a development permit, just like it used to be. 6 or 7 years ago, we used to issue permits for managing thickened vegetation. And that applies to a bunch of other infrastructure things that fall outside of the scope of self-assessable codes or exempt clearing. Okay, we're going to sort of get a little bit into like specifically people who are trying to do fodder harvesting and are struggling to get their head around it. It's very similar to what it used to be. The catch is this notification and re-notification and supplying maps. So you can obviously call the veg hotline. Our guys do a lot of that, the notifications with landholders over the phone. You can come to the counter at Charleville or Roma, and we do a lot like that as well. But once you get the hang of it, it's actually fairly easy to do it from home if you've got a sort of half decent internet connection. If you haven't, try to make a day when you're coming into town to come in and see us, and we'll do it. We'll do it at the counter. It takes, I think, one of our blokes here did 13 notifications in about 10 minutes. Where a fellow was doing multiple lot notifications for forest activity. So it is pretty quick for us to do it. Anyway, but the trickiest part of this is making your little map for your notification, or that's what I find the trickiest. And so we've got a little system that we use in Charleville to do that. We use Queensland Globe. So you get into Queensland Globe, and once you've accepted, you've ticked the box and said, yes, I accept the conditions of use, you'll get this screen. Once you get this screen open, the next trick is to tick the topics button. So once you tick the topics button, you'll get this sort of page. You click on the agriculture button there, and the one you get up is vegetation management. You go down to the launch topic and click launch. It asks you whether you want to just add it to the globe or replace the current topic, and I just add it to the globe. Zoom in on your property. I'm sorry if this is your property. I just randomly zoomed in on somebody's property. If you recognise it, try to forget that it's yours. Anyway, now it's showing me the blue. It's showing me basically where there's some Cat B and where there's some Cat C, and the rest is Cat X. The stuff not covered by that mapping. So in the layers, I actually want to look at the regional ecosystems. I want to see what regional ecosystems they are. So I click that layers button. And I turn off the RVM mapping, and I turn on these ones where it says vegetation management regional ecosystem map labels, Cat A or B containing endangered regional ecosystems, Cat A or B containing of concern regional ecosystems, Cat A or B that is least concern regional ecosystems. So I've turned them on, and this is my new map. It's showing me that I've got this regional ecosystem containing an of concern or regulated vegetation map containing of concern regional ecosystems there. Now in this case, it's got some 651 and some 652. It says it's 651 70% and 652 30% there. I know you probably can't read that, but I looked at it earlier. Now this is a classic case of where you'll be self-assessing. So in this case, you'll find that some of the areas are really mulga dominant. That there's just mulga trees everywhere, and in some cases you'll find that there's not very much mulga at all, and a lot of poplar box. And so you can self-assess that the stuff that's all mulga, with just scattered box through it, that's going to be your 651, and the stuff that's got the a little bit of Mulga scattered through it, but mostly box is going to be your 652. And so when you're using your pulling strips, you stick to the areas that have got that sort of, Mulga dominant regional ecosystem. That's your 651. That's going to be fine. Now another little trick here is that you can click that sort of down arrow on the category A or B containing of concern regional ecosystems and change the opacity, so you can make that layer more see-through, so you can see the satellite scene underneath it, and that'll help you maybe work out where the bulk of your fodder trees are. The next thing I'm going to do is draw a little shape. And so what I do is I go up into here and I click there's a little spanner. I click that, and then I click the little triangle, which allows me to draw a polygon, and then I just draw that shape. That's where I want to fodder harvest. And to finish the shape, I double click at the end. Now that shape there is saved in my places. So once I double click and finish that shape, I've got this shape here. It's saved in my places on the screen. If I click down that little down arrow on my places, it's actually going to give me the area of that polygon. So in this case, it's 389.47 hectares. So if that's the bit I want to do, I'm within my 500 hectare limit. So that's a good notification. What we often do at the Charleville counter is that people want to go in, that they say, well, I might want to go there, I might want to go up here, and I might want to go over there. So we'll draw 3 polygons, maybe 150 hectares each in size. And it works exactly the same way. You draw the 3 polygons. You get my place 1, my place 2, my place 3. And you can download them all together at the same time. So I've checked that. I know that my area is about right. I haven't gone over. It's about the size that I want. I then click the download button. And what I find quite easy is clicking on the KML. So that's the one that works in Google Earth. So I click the KML to download it as a KML. It'll say, where do you want to save it? Or open or save. I click the save button, click OK. I tell it to save it in a particular location where I know where it is. And that's that. So I've got my little shape saved away. When I go in and do my fodder notification, you'll get to the point where it says, add a map. You just drag that KML from the folder you saved it in into the box where it says, drop your shape here, and that's it. So that's how you do your map. Now you can use that KML in a number of ways. There are ways to put it onto Google Maps. There's a bunch of different apps that you can get for your iPad or your phone that will open up a KML. Probably what you'll find, if you want some better instructions, like face-to-face instructions on how to use that, you can either come to the counter at Charleville or Roma, or AgForce are actually running a bunch of workshops next week. If you look up their website, you'll find those. They're Morven, Cunnamulla, Quilpie, and Thargomindah. If you come to one of those sessions, you'll actually find there's officers there who will show you how to use, show you how to do that mapping, show you how to put it on your computer, and potentially even show you a couple of the apps that you can use, so that when you're driving your bulldozer, you can actually follow the map on your phone or your iPad. So that's kind of fodder harvesting. Once again, if you want to really get into details about the actual fodder accepted development clearing code, it's free to notify. That's one way you can do your maps. It's quite easy. But come along to one of those sessions or ring the Veg hotline, that number in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Come to the counter. We can go through it in detail with you. Basically, you can still harvest fodder. There's been a few changes to it, but yeah, it's still free to notify. The trickiest bit we've found is doing that little map up. Doing the self audits, we've got a link to that on the handout. If you have a look at that form, I think you'll see that it's fairly easy to get through. It's basically a bunch of check boxes, and really, if you're able to notify, so if you're able to put in your notification, you're in Southwest Queensland, you're in the Mulga lands, or even the Brigalow Belt, in a Mulga regional ecosystem, you sort of automatically tick a lot of the boxes because it says, are you in the Mulga lands, are you harvesting for fodder? And then there's some stuff around strip widths, making sure that you got your strip widths right. You check all those boxes. You keep a copy of that, put it in your filing cabinet. That's it. You don't need to send it to us. But you just do that before you re-notify. It'll ask you, are you re-notifying? Did you do your self audit? Yes, I did. Away you go. Do your next 500 hectares. So we'll touch on compliance and monitoring because I know a lot of people are interested in this. So probably everyone's heard about the early detection system by now. That's one of the tools that we use. It's based on Landsat imagery, which comes out every 16 days, and a comparison is made between the image that we get and the image 16 days prior to see where clearings occurred. A bunch of people go through that and look for if there's fodder notifications, permits, things like that over those areas. If they can't find anything like that, and it's pretty obviously clearing, then they'll get in contact with that person. A lot of people just get a letter saying, we noticed some clearings occurred, just check that you're following the laws. Some people get a follow-up phone call. In fairly bad cases, there might be a site inspection and something like a restoration notice or even a penalty infringement notice issued. If it's really disastrous, it might be a bit more serious, but that's very rare. I saw the latest early detection system stuff came out yesterday. There was only about 4 notifications for the state, so it's pretty. The numbers are really dropping on the amount of clearing that's being done that's outside of the scope of permits or self-assessment or exemptions. We're really getting a lot less of that now. We do audits from time to time. I think our target is around 30 for this coming year. They're generally fairly random, although we do, if something looks a bit dodgy from the satellite imagery, we'll often audit that. And, we might be sort of talking to a landholder about, well, you've got to, widen the strips that you keep a little bit and narrow the strips that you're harvesting a little bit. That's the kind of conversations that we have often during an audit. But the bulk of our audits so far have all come up fine. They've been random, just based on notifications, and the bulk of our audits come up fine. There's also the SLATs, which you're probably all aware of as well, which is the annual state land cover and tree study. The interesting thing about that one is that the minister was out here last week and he was talking about that they're now going to start measuring regrowth vegetation. So they're going to start measuring how much vegetation is actually regrowing. I don't know if you remember, but there was a few questions asked, particularly by AgForce, about, well, you're measuring how many trees are growing back. And the answer was, we don't know how many trees are growing back. And so there's been a specific project now that SLATs will include that data from now on. So that'll be very interesting to see that next year and what sort of figures come up there. So that's kind of information provided by members of the community. So that's the top one there. And realistically, that seems to be the ones that are getting investigated a lot now. Is we get calls. It's particularly coastal. We don't get. It only makes up something like 2% of the phone calls to the hub, but often people go to an office and complain or write a letter because someone's clearing trees near their property at Noosa or something like that. So you'll find that there's a lot of that going on. So early detection system, I've kind of gone through that 16-day cycle. we see all the clearing, it gets filtered, explained or unexplained. You may get a phone call if you come up on that. That's kind of what we see. That's what we see when we're looking at it. The shapefile is automatically generated, and when we look at it, we see that sort of progression of clearing. It's fairly easy to see. And then we've got the Planet Labs imagery, which comes out every day, where we can focus in a little bit more on it to see what's going on. So there's a lot of publicly available imagery. You'll find links to a lot of this stuff on the information sent. There's a whole range of different resolutions. You know, in that top right-hand picture, you can actually see the bulldozer pushing up the trees. That's probably Earth Eye. But say the other one's spot imagery, and then there's an old air photo there. So compliance tools, there's a range of methods. We use to monitor vegetation management activities. Low priority stuff, little areas that don't quite, they're probably a little bit wider than a exemption or something like that. You'll get a map and an educational letter. Something a bit worse, you'll get a phone call and maybe a warning letter. High priority, there'll be further investigation. You know, someone will probably come out there. Court action, absolutely a last resort. It's normally for people that won't stop once they've been told, you know, what you're doing is not legal, and they sort of thumb their nose and say, well, I'm going to do it anyway. Basically, in those cases, you sort of have to take people to court to make them stop. So who's responsible for clearing? Landholders and contractors share responsibility. Landholders have got to keep an eye on what the contractors are up to. It's not really, you know, if someone clears a bunch of country on your place, you know, you sort of can't walk away and say, well, there was a naughty contractor that did all that. You'll share some responsibility with them over that. So landholders should provide contractors with a copy of the authorisation. So if you've done your fodder notification, a copy of that notification and the map. Keep records of clearing activities. Keep an eye on what's going on. And you know, contractors can also be held liable. So where you know, the landholder says, yes, I've got all the authorisations to do that, the contractor really needs to cite that sort of stuff. So the key steps, what's the purpose of the clearing? Which legislation applies to the purpose? Obtain a property report. Check which clearing option applies to your property and progress as appropriate. Remember, landholder and contractors are responsible for clearing activities, and be aware of the responsibilities before clearing activity starts. So we get a lot of phone calls in the hub that are dealt with by, you know, it's a fire management line or fixing up an old fence or building a house. A lot of things are just exempt activities, but they ring up, they ask, we say, yep, go for it. We make a record of the phone call. We say, this person rang us on this day. We told them it's fine for you to build a single residence on a lot if you've got your council approval. It's fine to build that fire line 10 metres wide along your boundary fence. And so that's entered in a system. If there's any sort of compliance activity or anything afterwards, the first thing they do is look at whether someone's called up about that property, and they'll see that in there. They'll say, oh, well, it's just the fire management line. They rang up, they got authorisation. You know, they made sure it was all good. We'll close that case down. So call before you clear. 135 Veg. There's an email address there. Website. There's a lot of information there. We got a couple of questions from some carbon guys about how this affects, you know, affects carbon sales. So it generally doesn't affect people who are sequestering carbon. The only time it might affect you is if you're on freehold land and you didn't get a PMAV, and some of that area is now category C. So where it's regulated vegetation, often those carbon offsets can't apply. So The bulk of it's totally unaffected. But yeah, just if someone hasn't got a PMAV, they may be affected as far as carbon sequestration goes, if they want to put a carbon scheme on their property. Now, the flip side of that is that there has been this, a fund announced by the Minister for Natural Resources, Mines and Energy. So I see that in some material released by Anna Palaszczuk, and it's around a $500 million fund for restoring ecosystems. So restoring and revegetating degraded grazing land, provide income and diversification for farmers. I also see that they formalised more arrangements around landholders who want to enter into carbon funds getting access to imagery and help from the department in doing that. So obviously they're fairly keen to assist landholders who want to go into those carbon funds. Yeah, I noticed that they've more formalised that sort of arrangement where you can definitely get help from us around your imagery, air photos, historic clearing permits, all those sort of things that you might need for that. By all means, give us a ring and we'll give you a hand.